My name is Tom Hales. I work for NIOSH, and I'm the moderator and speaker for today's session, this morning's session on the NIOSH Firefighter Cancer Study. The format of the session is we have 4 presenters. Each will take between 15 and 20 minutes and then leave 5 to 10 minutes at the end of each presentation to take questions from the audience, and then we'll take some questions at the end of this session as well. Before I actually start into my session, which is sort of the background to how the NIOSH study got started, I want to thank the IAFF and the whole executive staff for inviting us here today. It's an honor to be here and to present at really what I think in the fire service is the premier safety and health conference in the whole fire service. I'd like to particularly thank Jim Brinkley and Pat Morrison, who actually asked us to speak at this session and set it all up for us. With that, I'm going to spend about 5 or 10 minutes talking about the background to this study. And for those who have been following the study and like when are the results coming and following the progress of the study, it is a 4-year study, and we are at the end of the 3rd year, or the end of phase 1 of the study, and we are presenting results for the first time of the results of phase 1. And I couldn't think of a better safety and health conference to present those studies at the Redmond. So what's the background to the study and how to get started? What I'm going to be talking about is who requested the study, what was being requested, and why it was requested. Who was requesting it? Really, it got started back in the mid-2000s by Barbara Mikulski, who's a senator from Maryland. And she got contacted from some firefighters in one of the counties in Maryland about a brain cancer cluster. And Jonathan Samet at the Johns Hopkins University did a cancer cluster investigation, said, yes, there's a huge excess in brain cancer here, but the sample size is so small, we need to do this study in a larger group. And we need to do a national study on cancer in the fire service. And so he went to Barbara Mikulski, and she lobbied for that effort. Unfortunately, money didn't come with that initially, so that process was delayed a little bit. The second big requester was from the IAFF, both Rich Duffy, Pat Morrison, and Jim Melius, and we actually sat down in their office and discussed this issue of should NIOSH undertake a firefighter cancer study, and they were extremely not only supportive but actively encouraged us to undertake this effort. The other group that was important actor in getting us involved was the IARC, which is the International Agency for Research on Cancer based out of France. And they did a review of cancer in the fire service, and they found that there was a lot of exposures that firefighters have that are known carcinogens, but the number of studies that were done to assess whether there actually was an increased risk of cancer were lacking, and they were limited. And they encouraged another organization, i.e. NIOSH, to do a larger cohort study of that effort. And finally, the National League of Cities, they contracted with Tridata to do a review of the literature of firefighting and cancer. And although the results of that study are clearly caused a lot of debate and controversy within the fire service, one of their recommendations is we need more data and we need more large cohort studies to assess the relationship. In addition to those groups that were actively requesting us, there were also a large amount of supporting organizations. And within the fire service, this includes the IAFC, the Chiefs Group. Billy Goldfeder was extremely involved and encouraging. Also the Firefighter Cancer Support Network, and Mike LeBron was very active. The funding for the study is primarily from NIOSH internal funds, not extra money that Congress gave us to do the study. This was internal NIOSH money, and it was supplemented by the U.S. Fire Administration, and we want to thank Bill Troop for that money he did bring to us that helped the study move along. And also our other partner was the National Cancer Institute, who provided not only review and study design issues, but also some of the data from some of their, one of their cohort studies. What all these groups recommended was a large epidemiologic study to assess the relationship between firefighting and cancer. might ask, well, why do we need to do that? And there's really two pieces of information about that. One is, what are firefighters exposed to? And then, what is the outcome data? What evidence is there that firefighting is associated with cancer? And I'd like to briefly touch on both of those. So let's talk about exposure. According to IARC, the group out of Lyon, France, they did a review in 2010 that they published about the exposures firefighters have to fire smoke and what are the multiple hazardous constituents of those, but also what are the health effects of those, particularly regarding cancer. And they identified 9 group 1 carcinogens in fire smoke. And what's known by group 1 carcinogens is it's known to be carcinogenic to firefighters, or known to be carcinogenic to humans. They identified 4 group 2A, which is probably carcinogenic to humans, and 21 group 2B substances, which are possibly carcinogenic to humans. Now, having said that, that's fire smoke. We know that you guys aren't exposed to fire smoke because you wear SCBA. Is that right? Right? So SCBA has a protection factor of 10,000. So if you're wearing your SCBA, there's a pretty darn good protection against fire smoke. But we know, I know as watching you guys, that there are a lot of times when you don't wear your SCBA, particularly during ventilation, as you can see in this picture here, in which the firefighter is ventilating the roof and the window, but as you can see, they don't have their mask on. The second issue is overhaul. Overhaul is incomplete combustion. There are known carcinogenic agents in the overhaul smoke. And Bolstad Johnson from Phoenix has done a very nice job of identifying some of the substances that are carcinogenic during overhaul, and that includes benzene, 1,3-butadiene, and formaldehyde above the occupational exposure limits for those chemicals. In addition to fire smoke, there are other carcinogens that you're exposed to. That would include PAHs, which can be absorbed through the skin, and also diesel exhaust at your fire stations, particulate matter that is very fine and small that can get into the lungs that is associated with lung cancer and air pollution studies. You're exposed to asbestos, and we know asbestos is a lung carcinogen as well as other tumor sites. And also your turnout gear gets contaminated, it is not cleaned very often. So there are a number of reasons of why you're exposed to carcinogenic agents. The second question is, has that exposure resulted in increased rates of cancer in firefighters? And that's what I call outcome studies. And although these other organizations that requested us to do this study said there wasn't enough evidence or limited evidence, it wasn't that this issue hasn't been studied. In fact, as an occupational groups, there have been a large number of studies relatively to other occupations about your risk of getting cancer. There's been 19 published cohort studies, 11 case control studies, and 14 other study designs of which have looked at this issue. Unfortunately, when you look at the results of those, the results are mixed. Some of those studies show there is an association, and some do not. But all of them suffer from the same limitation, is that they're very small, and they can't detect small increases and significantly increases among firefighters. And they are extremely difficult to find an association for rare tumors or rare cancers, so there's very few cases. To get around this issue of small numbers and small studies, there is an epidemiologic principles where you can throw these studies together in one group and analyze it. So you take those 19 cohort studies, you take all those case control studies, and you put them into one data set, and you analyze it to see, is there increased risk? So you get around this issue of small numbers. Unfortunately, meta-analysis, and that process or those studies are called meta-analysis. Unfortunately, meta-analysis has its own limitations as well. But in either case, there have been 4 studies that have done meta-analysis on the relationship between firefighting and cancer. And this goes back to 1990 by a study by Howe and Birch. And what Howe and Birch showed, and let me just take a minute to talk about what the SMR means. SMR is standardized mortality rate. That's where you take the observed number of cancers over the expected number for the general population usually, adjust for age and sex and race, and come up with, is it increased or not? So if you have an SMR greater than 1, it's associated, but it has to be statistically significant with the confidence interval. So what does all that mean? If you looked at Howe and Birch's meta-analysis, only one cancer popped up as associated with firefighting, and that was a malignant melanoma. But that was in 1990, so those were studies published in the 70s and 80s, and it was a very small number of studies that were included in that, 5 to 9 studies in those analyses. Another study was published in 2005. This wasn't published. This was actually available publicly on their website by Jonathan Samet and his colleague at the Johns Hopkins University. And exactly opposite of what Birch found, Birch and Howe, was that they did find a statistically significant increase in all cancers and the 11 subtypes you see there. And all of those were statistically significant. And then you go to the study that's probably the most reputable, which is by Grace LeMasters at the University of Cincinnati, published in 2006. And she found that there were 4 types of cancer that were statistically significantly elevated: testicular multiple myeloma, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, and prostate cancer, and 8 additional subtypes that were possibly associated with firefighting. And they looked at a large number of studies, over 32. Since this was published in 2006, IARC, which is doing a review of the relationship between firefighting and cancer, 2 additional large cohort studies were done. So they redid the analysis, looking at 42 studies, and they found that the following 3 cancer subtypes were associated with firefighting and cancer: testicular, prostate, and non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. The IARC group concluded that there is limited evidence in humans for the carcinogenicity of occupational exposure as a firefighter, and they called that a group 2B, which is possibly carcinogenic to humans. But if you look at all the study limitations, meta-analysis is not a perfect analysis. It's not as sound methodologically as a cohort study. Few of these studies looked at vital status. In other words, since 1989, in other words, they're missing a whole generation of firefighters. There's limited data in these cohorts about females and non-whites. Almost all of these studies excluded them because non-whites and females because there were such small numbers. All of these studies had small numbers, as I mentioned before. There are small numbers of cancers reported, small numbers of what we call person years at risks, small numbers of rare cancers. Very few of these studies looked at incidence of cancer besides death rate. Death rate is your SMR. Standardized incidence rate, or SIRs, is what you get with an incidence study. So in other words, cancers that may occur but not kill you would be missed in those cohort mortality studies. Few of the studies had exposure assessments associated with them. In other words, they couldn't stratify firefighters about how many carcinogens they would have been exposed to and for how long. And few of those studies compared firefighters to get around this issue of the healthy worker effect. So for all those limitations, NIOSH did undertake this effort of doing a 4-year study of looking at firefighters, cancer in the fire service. Please welcome Mr. Crow to discuss the recently released white paper on firefighter and cancer. So let's give him a quick hand.
From beginning.
Perfect. And then just use either. All right, very good. Not my computer, so thank you very much for the assistance. Thank you all for being here this morning. For the final day of a conference for an early morning, we have a pretty good crowd out here. And what I'm going to bring you today is a perspective that we came together with as we did a study, or an accumulation of looking at studies this last spring in Indianapolis. First off, I'd like to thank again the panel that's here and also the IFF for inviting us to come in today. Taking action against cancer in the fire service. Is it time? I can think back when I was hired 30 years ago what my job was like, what I wore, what my turnouts were like. The air bottle on my back was steel. Was it heavy? Those that can think back can think about that. Did we take them off early? We took them off early. And with that came a lot of damage, and a lot of damage to ourselves. We also saw a lot of brothers and sisters also. Maybe we didn't call it cancer back then, but they retired, and they died, and nobody kept track of how they died. So what we did with this study is we took a look at, first off, we invited a lot of folks. And if you can look at, in front of everybody's seat, hopefully, there's going to be what is called our white paper. This is an accumulation of a lot of studies that came together through the eyes of a couple dozen people who looked at it, both firefighters, the science side, the research side, and also through the training areas as well. Discussions address prevention, diagnosis, treatment of work-related cancer. Most importantly, I'll go to the bottom, a series of actions were identified that firefighters can perform to reduce their exposures. We all have individual responsibilities to ourselves and to our families. We're not only affecting ourselves if we get cancer, we're affecting our workplace, we're affecting our wives, our spouses, our significant others, our children. We're protecting them as well by protecting ourselves. Statistically higher. We've heard this study. I could do counterpoint, but I won't because I come from a suburban type department in Southern California. All right, after 30 years of working there, I know what I was exposed to. I know that now we're looking at fires differently. But again, some of these things we're going to be seeing up here are going to be repetitive from what we've had before, so I won't keep them up too long. The testicular side, the multiple myeloma, brain cancers we're seeing increases of, breast cancers we're seeing increases of as well. And there is a study we believe being done in San Francisco that's going to kind of tie that together for us. I can't wait to see that. What are we doing? We're working in active overhaul environments with SCBAs on our backs, but no masks on our faces. Sound familiar? Fire's out, they call it controlled, what do? Take a breather, go outside a little bit, overhaul, we need to overhaul it well enough so the arson guys, investigator guys can come in and take a look at it. Is it still smoking, still smoldering? Usually. Non-burn combustible materials, which has already been described today? Absolutely. The construction of homes today that I fought 30 years ago, which might have been 30 years old, those materials different than they are what today? Plastics, think of everything in there. Think of the furniture in there. Think of all the appliances in there, the computers in there. Everything in there that's going to be burning up is giving off different materials than they gave off 30 years ago. It is a different environment for us. Firefighters wearing carcinogen-loaded helmets and bunkers gear is a symbol of their life experience. Going on in our fire stations? We can just go down this list, and I don't want to do that, but diesel exhaust contaminates many fire stations. Do we all have diesel exhaust systems within our stations now? Are they all operating? Are we getting off the rigs and plugging them in as they come in? Or are we waiting until we back in, allowing the station, the apparatus floor again, the engine bay to fill with smoke, sooty smoke? This is all within the white paper. So as you go through this, and I'm going to go through this fairly quickly, please spend the time going through it later on, maybe on the airplane going home. Take it back to the fire stations. Look at it. More copies are available. There's an email address in there which you can request more, and you can print it yourself by going online. Do we shower after returning to a fire station, after a fire? Just think about our habits. We all have individual habits. Where did those habits, where were they developed from? Okay. But all these habits we currently have, what's it doing to us? And this is from Grace LeMaster. Pinpointing the cause of cancer is extremely difficult. We realize that. Firefighters aren't exposed to just one agent. Look at what we're inside now. They're exposed to multiple cancer-causing agents because of multiple exposures and multiple routes of exposures. They inhale carcinogenics, and carcinogenics are absorbed through the skin. It's highly unlikely for firefighters to get one type of cancer. Several of the guys on my job had multiple cancers. Something came up 10 years, something came up 3 years later, different types. I think if you think about this within your own jobs, you're going to recognize the same things as well. Our exposures have increased. With that, though, also has increased our ability to survive. And that's what this one's going to show. In the 1970s, five-year cancer survival was only a dismal 43%. All right? Medicine's gotten better. They're recognizing it. They're treating it better. Now, today, a 5-year survival rate for all cancers is 67%. So the medicine side is picking it up. It's helping us. It's helping us survive. But it's our responsibility to help ourselves not to even get to that point, if that's possible, by taking care of who we are, our equipment. Huge upswing number of cancer survivors, just over 3 million, 71 to 12 million in 2012. Talk about University of Cincinnati, because that was the main one that we had to look at. If we would have held off on this study a year later, perhaps a year and a half, we would have had the NIOSH study. Might that have brought different perspective to us? Probably. But we couldn't wait. An example I'll use is last October in California, we had our memorial. 40 firefighters went on that wall, 27 from cancer. These are young men and women in their 30s and 40s and early 50s. We can't wait. So that was the driving point for us with this study, was to get this out. Could we do something in 2 years later or 3? I think we will. Okay, we need to. We need to keep current what we're doing and also to try to help ourselves. A key with this one we want to bring out to you, September 2012, U.S. government announced 70,000 surviving firefighters, police officers, first responders. It was recognized cancer is a problem with them then, are entitled to free monitoring and treatment for 50 forms of cancer. We believe this is the first time the federal government has recognized cancer as probably being a problem within the fire service or people that respond to those types of incidents. As I developed these PowerPoint slides for you, I know I packed a lot in there, but I want to look at one big piece on this one right now. There are 2 routes of greatest contamination. Entry of carcinogenics into the bodies of firefighters through the lungs, dermal absorption. Who would have thought, I didn't think 30 years ago, that what I was exposed to when I didn't have a hood, when I just had a mask, that through my neck, through my jawline, I was going to be absorbing cancer-causing materials into my system. Never would have thought that. It's reality, though. It is what it is. This is something we need to worry about. The lungs, we do wear the SCBAs. They're a lot better now. They're a lot more comfortable. They're a whole lot lighter, and we keep them on. But when we look at fire scenes now, we're looking at these almost now as a hazmat. Where's our hot zone? The hot zone going to be the fire itself, maybe a few feet away from it? Warm zone? Cold zone? Where's the cold zone? How far away are we? Well, we're not going to be exposed to it. But thinking also as we go into those fires, as we're crawling in, we're absorbed by the smoke. We're absorbed by the heat. What's happening? All of our pores are opening up. And there's going to be a slide I'll go through with that. But that's staying in our jackets, isn't it? It's staying in our hair. You go back to the fire station, you clean up, you put the hose back on, you get that rig ready, you're ready to go. What do we do then? Let's take a shower. But that rig's got to get ready first, doesn't it? Because we might have to have another call out of that station. All right, I can remember times coming back 2-3 days later, washing my hair at home, still smelling smoke. It stays with you. It stays on you. Okay? Steps to consider when a firefighter tells you they have cancer. Remember, we are a support network, a support organization. When somebody finds us on the internet or finds who we are about through somebody else, they call us, they go through the internet, they ask for help. What the Firefighter Cancer Support Network has done in the past, and we still do because it's something we're very proud of, we send out boxes full of materials and organizing materials. This allows that person, that family, to kind of start getting their ears going, we're starting to fight this thing now. We send that out immediately. Usually it gets across the country in a couple of days. With that, we also have mentor support group. If that person would like to talk to somebody that's had a similar cancer that they've had, we have survivors, over 110 survivors, and we have several of them in the room today that are available to talk to people. A firefighter talking to a firefighter. That's what we're about. Now, this last year, we're looking at the problem. The problem's not going away. The problem's getting worse. There needs to be an educational piece of it. All right? We're broadening our tip, if you will, from being a support group now to also figuring out how can we educate ourselves. And this is one of the first steps we're doing is with this white paper. Some of the questions you can ask each other, but obviously company officers, you're the closest group, within your companies, all right? You're the ones right there. Battalion chiefs, they have their responsibilities. Crews, if you're a good, tight crew, you guys talk. We call ourselves family, don't we? We call ourselves brother and sister. That's who we are. That's who we are to each other. In this room as well, that's who we are. We need to be able to talk to them. We need to be good listeners as you go down this list. And everything that's going to be on these slides is going to be in the paper that's going to be in front of you. What can we do? Immediate actions we can do. Wear the SCBA longer. Uncomfortable, take the mask off, but we're still in the smoke. All right, we need to be thinking ourselves. Company officers need to be thinking of our men and women. All right, keep those masks on a little longer. Gross decon. Do we go out in the street? You got a little insulation on your shoulders. You got drywall. Are we hosing ourselves off pretty good up there? We need to. We need to do a little bit of we need to do a gross decon on the fire. If you've been in the middle of it, you need to be washed off up there. Use wet Napa or baby wipes to remove so much soot as possible. Where are we going to do that? The hoods. The hoods are pretty much single, maybe sometimes a double layer. They do their job. Okay, I haven't had any burns here since I started wearing those. I used to singe earlobes every now and then on fires. All right, wipe yourselves down what's exposed. The gauntlets, the gloves, wipe the hands down. If you're in a rehab area, you're getting water, they're giving you donuts or something along that line, clean those hands. Otherwise, you're going to be ingesting the stuff you just came out of. Okay? Change your clothes, wash immediately after fire, shower after fire. These make sense to us. Can we do that now operationally at our fire station? We have to be able to think along those lines now. What's best for my men and women? All right, what's best for my troops? Stop using tobacco products. Use sunscreen or sunblock. I hope we're doing that, all right, because that's a problem with us as well. I'm going to finish with this slide. We get thank you letters quite often. They come to the office. This picture came in place of a thank you letter. It's a family. All right, firefighter diagnosed with cancer. We have we have blue wristbands. We send out to people with these. We have them at our booths. This is a husband, the firefighter, wife, and child. If nothing else, what we take away from this is we have to be supportive of our family by taking care of ourselves. Nobody wants to cut our lives short. We certainly don't want to pass what we have with us on to our family as well, because if we're bringing home dirty clothes, we're bringing home those cancer-causing materials. Okay? All right. That's the best we can do in about 15 or 20 minutes. Obviously, this can be a lot longer. Please read the white paper. There's a lot of good information there. There's a lot of thinking that's going to go on in there. It's going to scare you a little bit, but it's stuff you need to take back to your stations, stuff you need to take back to your men and women.
This is a really big day because we're hearing yet another study that's confirming the connection between cancer and the profession of firefighting. Studies, just the nature of science, it's very hard to repeat studies to studies, but one thing that is consistent with almost all studies is that there is a connection between firefighting and cancer. And I just want to congratulate NIOSH on the great work that they've done, and I look forward to seeing it printed, because I know that what's happened is that presumptive legislation has really become a world issue. And it's become a world issue largely because we have caught the attention of IARC, the International Agency for Research on Cancer. What is presumptive legislation? You all know it's a reverse onus. It basically solves a problem in WCB. Firefighters were dying of occupational cancer, and they weren't getting recognized by their respective jurisdictions. The issue is still in its infancy, because although we've had it for decades in the United States and we've had it in Canada for the last 10 years, and the majority of states and provinces now have some form of presumptive legislation, we're seeing that it's now spreading around the world, especially with the third country in the world being Australia, that has just now recognized the link between cancer and the occupational firefighting, has become the third country in the world to create a presumptive legislation. The history of presumptive legislation starts in the United States, and it takes many forms. And this alone is just the history. We could go on for a long time, so I'm just going to go really quickly here. California, probably the template within the United States, probably the strongest legislation, goes into retirement, blanket coverage, and has had the cancer presumption since the 1980s, has been very successful in defending it. However, the battles are still going. I see states such as Montana, Idaho, New Hampshire, and Pennsylvania just recently gained presumptive legislation after a 30-year battle. So the battle is there. But what I want to really bring to the brothers and sisters here today is that it's now a global issue, and this issue can assist you in your jurisdiction in the United States and Canada, because you can use it as validation that this is not a North American issue anymore, it's a world issue. There's still other states dealing with the issue. They're deferring, they're widening the scope, and many states are trying to do the initial creation of the presumptive legislation. In Canada, it started off in 2002. We did not have one province covering occupational cancer through legislation, and just in a little bit over a decade, we now have close to 85% of the professional firefighters in Canada now have coverage. The template in Canada seems to be the Manitoba-Alberta model that has now went across Canada. It looks at 14 forms of cancer, which is the majority of cancers that firefighters get in the occupational realm. The other provinces are now coming up to the 14 cancers, but the 14 cancers seem to be the threshold, and it's very strong legislation. It goes into retirement, and many of the legislation, for instance, in my province, it was retroactive to 1992. It's basically working on the same model. Firefighting in Canada, you have a latency period, so you work X number of years, you get a certain cancer, it becomes an automatic coverage for workers' compensation. And the compensation is the same as if that firefighter had died going into a fire and was killed from a building collapse. And it's retroactive. But with the world expansion, Australia in 2011, in 2012, they moved into the realm of presumptive legislation, and today they have 12 cancers. And Australia did it a little bit different route. They went to the federal government of Australia, and I was over there and we spoke to the federal government of Australia, and what they decided to do is they went in and they did what's called a Senate inquiry. And the Senate inquiry did a study of all global scientific and material involving firefighting and occupational disease. And what the inquiry stated is science has confirmed what firefighters suspected for decades, that a disappropriate number of them in the prime of their lives are brought down with illness, usually reserved for the old and the infirm. And the legislation was based on science. The Senate committee report led to the federal legislation called the Safety, Rehabilitation, and Compensation Amendment, the Fair Protection of Firefighters Act. And what it did is it covered federal firefighters in the country of Australia for the 12 cancers. And what's important is that this Senate report is probably the largest federal inquiry into cancer and firefighting of any country in the world. And if you're going into battles, if you're going into issues related to presumptive legislation in your jurisdiction, you need this book beside you because it goes into the science. It talks about how the science of epidemiology is not tremendously exact. But if you look at all the science around the world, it is very clear that there is a risk between firefighting and the occupational cancer. And firefighters were dying of occupational cancer and they weren't being recognized, and that changed in Australia. It's probably the most powerful document ever put out by a government supporting the connection between occupational disease and firefighting. The conclusion of the Senate committee was the science underpinning this legislation is pivotal to its justification, hence the importance of the announcement here today by NIOSH. The committee received as evidence a large amount of research that has been conducted into the link between firefighter and cancer. Given the quality and quantity of the evidence presented, the committee is confident that a link between firefighting and an increased incidence of certain cancers have been demonstrated beyond doubt. I actually have a video, and I'm going to show you the video here in a second, in which it sort of shows you exactly what they did in Australia, and you'll see the template was started here in North America, and they used many of the ideas we had here, but it was the right thing to do, and it was passed unanimously last year in there. It's also expanded into Europe. We're seeing inroads in regards to the European community in countries such as Sweden, Denmark, Finland, and Norway. They're all presenting the Canadian model forward as a way to get the quickest type of legislation. And the way the European community works is once one country gets it, it would expand across the European community very quickly. But we have 4 countries that have showed a tremendous amount of interest, and I believe that within the next year 2 years, you will see a country in Europe also be covered under presumptive legislation, largely because now it's no longer a North American issue, it's a world issue, now that Australia has joined the ranks of countries that support their firefighters in occupational cancer. And what's happened as well is that IARC, for the first time, looked at firefighters, and although they did not rank firefighting as a profession as a probable or a conclusive connection to cancer, they did recognize the fact that there needed to be more research, there needed to be more stuff that needed to come forward. And IARC, I was in Copenhagen last year and I met with one of the doctors that sat on IARC, and they're going to be looking at firefighting again within the next year once the NIOSH study comes out. And as well, there's also one of the largest studies done in the world is being conducted right now in Australia under NIOSH University. I have the good fortune of being on the advisory committee for this study, and I believe it's also going to support the fact that firefighting has a very strong connection to occupational cancer. But if you're dealing with occupational cancer, presumptive legislation, the game really has changed because IARC has taken notice, and IARC is the most powerful organization in the world that can direct legislation not only in North America, Australia, but around the world. As I said, it was the first classification of firefighting 2B. Looking at firefighters again after NIOSH study, the NIOSH study, it's a classification of carcinogens as benzene, diesel particulates, etc. In conclusion, before I show a short video, we always do this for our firefighters who have lost. And I've been doing this now for 16 years, and I can tell you that in every jurisdiction I've been to, we've had firefighters who have been diagnosed with terminal cancer, and they gave up part of their last part of their lives to help us to put the face behind it. We can do the arguments, they can do the science, but it's about firefighters dying of occupational cancer and being properly recognized. And I always make a tribute and say that this is for them. All the spokespersons who have helped us in the last decade, who have literally given part of their last parts of their life. What I'm going to do now is I'm just going to show a short video.
This is a really important day because it's the first time in this Parliament that we've had a piece of legislation co-sponsored by people from 3 differing political parties, and it's because we are dealing with a very important issue that crosses political lines. I think the Australian public has enormous appreciation for the work of firefighters, the way they put their health and their lives on the line to go into fires in very dangerous situations to protect us, protect our property and protect our communities.
Deputy Speaker, recently I met with a delegation from the United Firefighters Union of Australia who came to Canberra to raise awareness about a life-threatening aspect of their profession. I'd like to draw the attention of the House to a very important issue of occupational health and safety as it relates to the firefighting profession. There is, Deputy Speaker, a proven link between firefighting and the risks of some cancers and heart disease. Evidence collected through studies in the United States and Canada have demonstrated that this link is a real and present danger to the health of firefighters everywhere and is in fact a leading cause of death amongst members of the firefighting profession.
Firefighters will now be covered by workers' compensation if they contract cancer as a result of their work. Firefighters from around the nation converged on Canberra today as all parties supported Greens legislation that will now assume certain cancers are work-related.
This is the most wonderful thing that has happened for firefighters. It's been a pretty emotional ride for myself and my family, and I just hope every politician can support it.
They say it's a win for those exposed to cancer-causing chemicals on the job.
Let's come back home now, and the Senate inquiry into occupational cancer suffered by Australian firefighters begins in Melbourne this morning.
For more, we're joined by our reporter Tony Nichols. Tony, good morning.
Well, good morning, Virginia. The Fair Protection for Firefighters Bill was introduced in July in response to data which shows that cancer is the biggest killer of firefighters worldwide. Now, firefighters would like to see occupational cancer compensated in the same fashion that traumatic injury is compensated. Now, already many states across America and Canada already provide this sort of legislation, with 2 countries in Europe also on the cusp of considering a similar style approach. Now, joining us this morning is the National Canadian Firefighting Representative, Alex Forrest. And Alex, why is Australia so far behind in this conversation?
Well, I think the big thing is just education. As soon as we met with the politicians here in Australia and we showed them the studies, the biggest thing that we saw was the politicians said, well, why aren't we doing this yet? So what we're trying to do is we're trying to right a big wrong. Australian firefighters are dying of occupational cancer and they aren't being recognized. They aren't being supported by any type of system of compensation. So the reason I'm here is to show them that Australia needs to be the 3rd country in the world to properly support their firefighters.
A Senate inquiry has heard firefighters are 5 times more likely to develop certain types of cancers than the average Australian. Their union wants the government to acknowledge the link and extend workers' compensation to firefighters who fall ill in the line of duty.
During his 26 years on the job, Ross Linley fought thousands of fires, many of them toxic. When he developed blood cancer, he contacted WorkCover.
They said that you had to prove which fire it was that you actually contacted cancer out of, and you just couldn't do it. Where do you start? You've been to so many fires that contribute.
Legislation is currently before federal parliament. If it passes, firefighters who contract cancer will be able to get workers' compensation.
And it doesn't matter what political stripe you are, it's just the right thing to do.
Canadian firefighter Alex Forrest told a Senate inquiry firefighters are present-day chimney sweeps, covered in carcinogens. He says while protective clothing has improved, it's designed to shield firefighters from flames, not toxic substances.
It is such a small cost, and if a firefighter dies in the course of their work and they die because of occupational cancer, it's no different than if they die trying to rescue a small child in a house when the roof collapsed.
This month marks the 20th anniversary of the chemical explosion at Coode Island in Melbourne. Ross Linley says firefighters have long risked their lives and now they're just asking for some support.
This legislation won't help me, I've done, but as for the future firefighters, we need this. We can't battle on our own. We can't be tossed aside onto the street.
Firefighters expect the federal government to make a ruling in the next few months. Kerry Ritchie, ABC News, Melbourne.
The guys up here have actually set another one for me so we can actually see how it progresses from the early stages right through to what they call flashover, which is when it becomes super hot and super dangerous. And I've just got to say this experience has been one of the most amazing experiences I've ever had in my life. I think I have a much better understanding now of what it might be to be in a fire, although these are actually very minor fires. This is equivalent of a 2-seater settee catching a flame and having to be put out. Whereas, of course, in an entire house, there's so much more combustible and the temperatures will be so much hotter.
I present the report of the Committee on the Provisions of the Safety, Rehabilitation and Compensation Amendment Fair Protection for Firefighters Bill 2011, together with a Hansard record of proceedings and documents presented to the Committee, and move that the report be printed. The bill would provide rebuttable presumption that a number of cancers developed by firefighters will be presumed to be work-related under the Commonwealth law. Subject to threshold tests set out in the bill, the burden of proof would be removed from firefighters with cancer. The committee had the opportunity to assess a large quantity of primary evidence demonstrating the scientific link between firefighting as an occupation and a number of cancers. study after study points to an elevated risk of cancer in firefighters. The research is robust and the committee unanimously accepts its conclusions.
Early in the inquiry, as Senator Marshall has indicated, the committee was concerned to address itself to the cost impacts on employers in the event that we were able to move to a circumstance in which easier and better availability and access to workers' compensation would be afforded. And of course that led to the Chief of the Fire Service from Edmonton in Alberta, with the goodwill of his minister, addressing the committee at its hearing in Perth. There were some interesting points came out of Commissioner Block's evidence to the committee. The first was that there had been no significant or discernible increase in workers' compensation costs to the service as a result of the inclusion of the cancers that were mentioned in his evidence.
The Tasmanian government's been called on to lead the nation in providing compensation to firefighters. A global campaign's been launched to provide compensation without question to all firefighters diagnosed with cancer during or after their service. The campaign started in Canada and has been successful in the United States and is now making its way through Australia.
It's not one fire that kills us, it's 300. And that's why this legislation is so important, because it shows recognition that the firefighter has been injured and unfortunately many times die of these cancers.
Mr Forrest says after 5 years of service, firefighters are at high risk of cancer. Those who've had to deal with it alone welcome the campaign.
It'd be great if this does get up for Tasmanian Fire Service.